Luke Davis had never been the kind of man to bow down to authority, especially not to a group of self-important bureaucrats who thought they could dictate what a man did with his own land. He had spent years building his life exactly the way he wanted it, away from the suffocating rules of city life, away from the kind of people who thrived on power plays and technicalities. His farm, a sprawling stretch of land on the outskirts of town, was more than just a home or a business. It was a symbol of everything he stood for. Independence, hard work, freedom. He had bought the land 5 years ago after walking away from the logistics company he had built from the ground up. That life had been a battlefield of contracts, backstabbing deals, and corporate greed, and he had no intention of ever returning to it. He wanted dirt under his nails, not a suit on his back. He wanted the satisfaction of putting in an honest day's work and seeing the results firsthand. The farm had given him that. It was early morning when Luke first realized something was wrong. The sun was still dragging itself over the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the fields. The crisp air smelled of damp earth and livestock feed, and the distant sound of his cattle shifting in their pens was the only noise breaking the silence. He had planned to make a supply run before the day got too hot, load up his truck with bags of feed and equipment he needed for repairs. But when he pulled up to the entrance of his property, his truck came to an abrupt stop. A heavy steel chain, thick enough to tow a semi-truck, was wrapped around the gate, secured with a brand new industrial-grade padlock. A bright yellow sign was fastened to the chain, the bold black letters stark against the metal. Access restricted. Entry prohibited until outstanding fees are paid. For a moment, Luke just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He blinked at the sign, his brain struggling to process what the hell he was looking at. Fees? What fees? His farm wasn't part of any association. He had made damn sure of that when he bought the land. He had personally gone through every document, every clause, every fine print detail to confirm that his property was exempt from any oversight by neighborhood organizations or governing bodies that could tell him what he could or couldn't do. And yet, here was a locked gate and a demand for payment, as if he were some delinquent tenant who had fallen behind on rent. Luke killed the engine and stepped out of the truck, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots oddly loud in the still morning. He walked up to the gate, inspecting the chain, the padlock, the sign. The metal links were new, the padlock gleaming under the early sunlight, no scratches, no rust. This had been done recently. Possibly overnight, his jaw clenched. Someone had come onto his property, without his knowledge, and put this here. The thought made his blood run hot, the slow simmer of anger creeping into his chest. He wasn't the kind of man who let things like this slide. If someone thought they could muscle him into submission, they were about to learn how wrong they were. Without hesitation, he grabbed the sign and ripped it from the chain, tossing it onto the ground. His first instinct was to cut the damn thing off himself, but he knew better than to act impulsively. He needed to find out who was behind this first. Luke pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. It rang twice before a clipped, professional voice answered. Office of Benjamin Carter speaking. Luke didn't waste time with pleasantries. Who the hell put a chain on my gate? There was a pause, just long enough to confirm that Carter knew exactly what he was talking about. Mr. Davis, the man said smoothly, if you've received notice of restricted access, that means there is an outstanding balance on your property's compliance fees. My property isn't under your jurisdiction, Luke cut him off. We both know that. So I'll ask again who put the goddamn chain on my gate. Another pause, this one shorter. Mr. Davis, you are listed as a member of the community, which means you are subject to our updated land use regulations. If you would like to discuss the matter, I'd be happy to set up an appointment. Luke exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. You set up the appointment, he said. I'll be there in an hour. He ended the call before Carter could say anything else. Luke wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what this was. A power play. An attempt to strong-arm him into compliance, to wear him down with bureaucracy and paperwork until he gave in. They wanted control over his land, and this was their way of making it happen. They were going to regret picking this fight. By the time he arrived at the office, his frustration had settled into something cold and focused. He pushed through the glass doors, ignoring the receptionist's attempt to stop him, and walked straight into Carter's office. The man was sitting behind a polished wooden desk, a stack of neatly organized folders in front of him. He didn't look surprised to see Luke, which only confirmed that this had been the plan all along. "Mr. Davis," Carter said with a measured smile, "I assume you're here to resolve your compliance fees." Luke leaned forward, planting his hands on the desk. "I'm here to tell you to take your chain off my damn gate before I cut it off myself." Carter's smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew. "You're welcome to do that," he said. "Of course, that would be considered destruction of community property, which carries additional penalties." Luke slammed his palm against the desk, making the papers jump. "You know damn well my property isn't part of this community." Carter didn't flinch. "It is now," he said simply. Luke stared at him, a slow realization creeping in. They had changed something. A zoning law, a boundary line, a legal technicality, something had shifted without his knowledge. And now they thought they had him trapped. But they had made a mistake. They had underestimated him. Luke straightened, his expression dark and unreadable. "I'll be seeing you soon, Carter," he said. He turned and walked out, already forming a plan in his head. They wanted to play games? Fine. But they were about to find out that Luke Davis didn't lose. Luke didn't waste time. The moment he walked out of Carter's office, he knew exactly what kind of game they were playing. This wasn't some clerical mistake, some misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a conversation. No, this was intentional. This was a power move, a calculated attempt to break him down, to frustrate him, to force his hand in a way that benefited them. And if there was one thing Luke despised more than anything, it was being manipulated. He drove straight back to the farm, the tightness in his jaw growing worse with each mile. He had no doubt that Carter and his people were watching him, waiting to see how he would react, expecting him to lash out in anger, to make a reckless decision that would give them more leverage against him. But he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. He had dealt with people like Carter before, back in his business days, men who smiled while they sank their teeth into your throat, who used bureaucracy as a weapon, because they didn't have the spine for a real fight. He had beaten them before. He would beat them again. When he pulled up to the locked gate, the chain was still there, thick and unyielding, the padlock glinting in the midday sun. The sign he had torn off earlier lay crumpled in the dirt, an ugly reminder that his own land was being used against him. He stared at it for a long moment, then took a deep breath and walked back to his truck. He had work to do. His first call was to his lawyer, not some big-name corporate firm, but a man he trusted, Daniel Price, an old friend who had handled his property purchase years ago. Daniel answered on the second ring, his voice calm and measured as always. "Luke, I was wondering when I'd hear from you. They've locked me out of my own damn farm," Danny Luke said, gripping the steering wheel. "Told me I owe them fees I never signed up for. And now Carter's sitting in his office acting like they have a legal right to do this." Daniel sighed. "I figured something like this might happen. You're not the first one they've pulled this on." That made Luke pause. "What do you mean?" "This isn't about you personally," Daniel explained. "They've been doing this for the past couple of years, changing property classifications, adjusting zoning boundaries, sneaking amendments into community regulations that weren't there before. It's slow, methodical. By the time property owners realize what's happened, it's too late. They either pay up or they get forced out." Luke's grip tightened. "And you didn't think to mention this to me." "I didn't think it would reach you," Daniel admitted. "Your land was never part of their jurisdiction. I checked myself when we finalized the purchase. They must have found a loophole." Luke ran a hand over his face. "Can we fight this?" "Depends on what they've done. I'll need to pull records, see what they changed and when. But listen, Luke, these guys aren't just making clerical errors. They know what they're doing. They count on people not having the patience or the resources to fight back. You're going to have to be ready for a long haul." Luke exhaled sharply. "Do it. Find out everything you can. I'm not letting these bastards take what's mine." All right, but Luke, don't do anything stupid. They're going to push you, try to make you react. Don't give them what they want. Luke ended the call and sat there for a moment, the weight of the situation settling in his chest. He wasn't just dealing with a bureaucratic headache. This was something bigger, something calculated. And if they thought he was just going to roll over, they were in for a rude awakening. His next move was to gather evidence. If Daniel was right and they had changed zoning laws or property designations, there had to be records somewhere. He started with his own documents, the deed, the purchase agreements, every contract and clause he had signed when he bought the farm. He spread them out across his kitchen table, flipping through them carefully, looking for anything that might have given them an opening. But everything was as he remembered it, clean, airtight. There was nothing here that gave them a right to claim jurisdiction over his land. So where had they made their move? His next step was the county records office. If any changes had been made, they had to be filed there. He drove into town, parked outside the dull, beige building, and walked in, doing his best to keep his frustration in check as he approached the clerk's desk. The woman behind the counter barely looked up. "What do you need?" "I need to see any zoning or jurisdictional changes made to property parcel 18-207 in the last 5 years," Luke said, sliding his ID across the counter. She sighed like he had just ruined her whole day, then typed something into her computer. The clicking of her keyboard filled the silence, and then she frowned at the screen. "That's odd." Luke leaned in. "What?" She turned the screen slightly. "There's a modification logged under your parcel number from 3 months ago, but it doesn't list a requester, just a code reference." Luke's stomach tightened. "Can you print that?" She hesitated. Technically, these kinds of changes are public record, but if there's no requester listed, it might be an internal adjustment. That means someone bypassed the usual process. Luke forced himself to stay calm. "Just print what you can." A minute later, he was holding a freshly printed document showing exactly what had been done. His land had been absorbed into the surrounding jurisdiction under a general land use amendment, bundled in with several other properties. The language was vague, deliberately so, but one thing was clear: this wasn't accidental. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure he was included. He clenched his jaw, thanking the clerk before heading back to his truck. He sat behind the wheel, staring at the paper in his hands. He had proof now, but proof alone wouldn't undo what had been done. This was about leverage, about who had more power, more influence, and right now Carter and his people thought they had the upper hand. Luke had spent years dealing with people who played dirty. He knew how to handle them. They thought they could push him into a corner, that he would cave under pressure. They were wrong. He pulled out his phone and called Daniel. "I've got the paperwork," he said. "They pulled this 3 months ago, wrapped it in legal jargon to make it look legitimate." Daniel exhaled sharply. "Damn it. All right, send me a copy. I'll start drafting a response." Luke nodded to himself. "Do that. But I'm not waiting around for them to screw me over again." "What are you planning?" Luke's voice was calm, but there was an edge of steel in it. "I'm going to make them regret ever coming after me." Luke had never been the kind of man to let things slide, but he also wasn't reckless. If he was going to win this fight, he needed to be smart about it. The fact that the zoning changes had been made 3 months ago without any notification meant that someone had intentionally kept him in the dark. The vague, bureaucratic language in the documents was a smokescreen, designed to discourage people from questioning it. But Luke knew how this game was played. It was all about pressure pushing property owners just hard enough that most of them gave up rather than fight. Most people didn't have the time, money, or patience to drag things through a legal battle. But Luke wasn't most people. The first thing he did was drive straight to the county records office again, this time bypassing the front desk and heading straight to the second floor, where the Office of Land Management was located. He didn't bother waiting to be invited in. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, drawing the attention of a middle-aged man in a beige suit, who looked up from his desk with mild irritation. "Can I help you?" the man asked, setting down his pen. Luke placed the printed zoning modification on his desk. "Yeah, you can tell me who authorized this change." The man adjusted his glasses and scanned the document, his expression unreadable. "This looks like a standard jurisdictional realignment," he said in that detached, bureaucratic tone Luke had always hated. "It happens from time to time as communities expand." "Cut the crap," Luke interrupted, leaning in slightly. "I know how these things work. You don't just reclassify private land overnight. Someone had to submit a request. I want to know who." The man pursed his lips, clearly weighing how much trouble Luke was worth. Finally, he let out a slow breath and turned to his computer. "I can check, but if it was done at the municipal level, the approval might not be documented here." Luke folded his arms and waited as the man typed, watching his eyes flicker across the screen. After a few moments, his brow furrowed slightly. "That's strange," he murmured. Luke didn't like that word. "What's strange?" The man hesitated before turning the monitor slightly. The modification was made under an executive adjustment clause, meaning it was pushed through without requiring a standard approval process. The only time that happens is if there's an overriding concern, like environmental impact or public infrastructure development. Luke stared at the screen. "Neither of those things apply to my land." The man nodded. "Which makes this irregular." He scrolled further. "There's no individual requester listed, just a directive code. That means it likely came from a higher authority, maybe the regional planning committee or someone with discretionary approval powers." Luke clenched his jaw. Someone had done this deliberately, hiding behind procedural loopholes to keep their hands clean. "Who has the power to issue these executive adjustments?" Luke asked. The man hesitated again. "There are a few officials at the county level, but if you're asking whether one of them personally signed off on this, you'd need more than just a hunch to get answers." Luke exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He had expected resistance, but now he had confirmation that this wasn't just some automated change. It had been pushed through by someone with authority. And he had a pretty good idea who that someone was. By the time he left the office, his mind was already racing with the next steps. He had to assume that Carter and his people were watching him closely, waiting for his response. He couldn't afford to make a move that they had already anticipated. If he tried to go through the usual channels, they would bury him in red tape, which meant he needed to make things uncomfortable for them. When he got back to the farm, the first thing he did was inspect the perimeter. He had walked this land 1,000 times, but now he was seeing it with new eyes. If they had gone so far as to change the zoning, what else had they done? Were there survey markers he hadn't noticed? Had they started infrastructure planning without his knowledge? As he walked along the northern boundary, he spotted something that made his stomach tighten. A fresh stake in the ground, painted bright orange. It was barely noticeable in the tall grass, but when he crouched down and examined it closer, he saw a small identification tag attached. It wasn't a standard survey marker. It was a lot designation. They were already dividing his land. Luke stood slowly, his fists clenched. They weren't just trying to force him into compliance, they were preparing for a sale. Somewhere on some developer's desk, there was already a proposal outlining how his land would be used once they pushed him out. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw Daniel's name on the screen. "I found something," Daniel said as soon as Luke answered. Luke exhaled. "So did I." "They didn't just change your zoning status," Daniel continued. "They filed a provisional development claim last month. It's sealed, but from what I can tell, they've categorized your land as pending acquisition. That means they've already started negotiating with buyers." Luke felt a cold, sharp anger settle in his chest. "They're selling my land before they even own it." "Looks that way," Daniel sighed. "Luke, this is getting serious. You need to be careful. If they've gone this far, they're not going to back off easily." Luke nodded to himself. "Yeah, I know." He ended the call and turned back toward the house, his mind already forming a plan. He had spent years dealing with corporate wolves, men who thrived on leverage and intimidation. If Carter and his people wanted to play dirty, he would show them just how messy things could get. That night, Luke didn't sleep much. He stayed up researching property laws, looking for every possible way to throw a wrench in their plans. He made lists, took notes, mapped out strategies. By the time the sun started creeping over the horizon, he had a clear objective. He wasn't going to fight them on their terms. He was going to make them regret ever coming after him. And the first step? He was going to start by finding out exactly who stood to profit from this deal. Because someone had already counted him as a loss. And Luke Davis had never been an easy man to write off. Luke knew that the moment he started pulling at the threads of this operation, things would get messy. People like Carter and his associates thrived on one thing: control. They controlled the paperwork, the regulations, the people who enforced them. They controlled the pace at which things moved, how long complaints sat unanswered, how fast approvals were pushed through when it suited them. But there was one thing they hadn't accounted for: Luke wasn't going to fight them in the way they expected. He wasn't going to drown in bureaucracy, wasn't going to waste time filing complaints they could bury. He was going to disrupt them in ways they couldn't anticipate. The first thing he did was find out who was circling his land like vultures. If there was already a development deal in the works, then there was a buyer. And a buyer meant there were negotiations, contracts, projections, plans that could be ruined if things became too complicated. Through Daniel, Luke managed to get his hands on a list of companies that had been involved in recent land acquisitions in the county. The list was long, filled with corporate names that meant nothing on their own. But one of them stood out: Horizon Development Group. They weren't just any developers. They specialized in large-scale projects, corporate expansions, high-end real estate developments. And they didn't waste their time on small plots of land. If they were interested in his farm, then they were planning something big. That meant they had already invested time and money into securing it, even before the sale was finalized. Luke wasn't going to let them have an easy transaction. The next day, he drove into town and parked outside a building he never thought he'd have a reason to visit: the Horizon Development Regional Office. It was a sleek, modern structure, all glass and steel, the kind of place where deals were made behind closed doors, where people like Carter met with investors who never had to get their hands dirty. Luke walked inside, ignoring the receptionist's polite but firm attempt to stop him, and headed straight for the nearest conference room, where a group of men in suits sat around a table covered in blueprints and documents. The room fell silent as he stepped inside. A man in his 50s, sharp-eyed and expensive-looking, stood up, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone clipped. Luke placed both hands on the table and glanced down at the papers spread out before them. He wasn't surprised to see a map of the area, with his farm marked in red. "Yeah," Luke said, his voice calm but firm. "I think you and I need to have a conversation about this piece of land right here." The man didn't flinch. "And you are Luke Davis, the owner of that land you're trying to buy out from under me." A flicker of recognition passed through the man's eyes, but he masked it well. He exchanged a glance with one of his colleagues before motioning toward the door. "I'm not sure what you think barging in here will accomplish, Mr. Davis, but this is a private meeting." Luke smiled, but there was no humor in it.
"Yeah, and that's my private property you're making plans for, so..."
"Let's cut the crap. I know you've been in talks with Carter and his people. I know they've been working to reclassify my land to make it easier for you to take it. What I don't know is whether you understand just how much of a mess you're stepping into." The man sat back down, regarding Luke with a mix of amusement and calculation. "We do everything by the book, Mr. Davis. If there's been a jurisdictional adjustment, then it was done legally." Luke exhaled slowly, then leaned in slightly. "Maybe. Or maybe it was done in a way that's going to turn into a goddamn nightmare for your company. Because let me tell you something about Carter: he doesn't do anything by the book. He bends rules, twists laws, finds loopholes. And when someone like me decides to fight back, all those little technicalities start looking a lot like fraud." The amusement vanished from the man's face. "Are you threatening legal action?" "I don't make threats," Luke said. "I just make things difficult. You think I'm going to sit back and let you take what's mine? You think I won't drag this deal through every regulatory hearing, every court case, every goddamn news outlet, until you realize it's more trouble than it's worth?" A tense silence settled over the room. Luke could see them doing the math in their heads, weighing the cost of pushing forward versus cutting their losses. He knew he wasn't going to stop them outright, not yet. But if he could make them hesitate, if he could make them doubt whether this was the easy acquisition they had been promised, then he had already won the first round. The man finally leaned forward, steepling his fingers. We'll review our position, he said smoothly. But if the sale was processed legally, then there's nothing to discuss. Luke gave him one last look before turning and walking out. He didn't need them to admit anything. He just needed them to start second-guessing. By the time he got back to the farm, he was already thinking 2 steps ahead. If Horizon Development started pulling back, Carter would know something was wrong, and that meant Carter would start getting desperate. Luke didn't have to wait long for the next move. That night, just past midnight, he was woken by the sound of tires crunching on gravel. He grabbed his shotgun and moved to the window, watching as a black SUV rolled up to the locked gate. 2 men got out, both dressed in dark clothing, both moving with the careful precision of people who didn't want to be seen. Luke stayed where he was, his heartbeat steady. He watched as one of the men walked up to the gate and pulled something from his pocket, a set of bolt cutters. They were trying to remove the chain. Luke didn't hesitate. He stepped outside, racking the shotgun loudly. The sound was unmistakable in the quiet night. Both men froze, then turned slowly. "Something I can help you with," Luke called out, his voice carrying through the darkness. The man with the bolt cutters hesitated, then forced a smile. "Relax, buddy. You were just trespassing," Luke interrupted, stepping forward just enough to make it clear he wasn't bluffing. "And unless you want to explain to the sheriff why you're out here cutting locks in the middle of the night, I suggest you get back in your car and drive the hell away from my property." The second man, the one closer to the SUV, muttered something under his breath. The first man hesitated, but then he shoved the bolt cutters back into his jacket and took a step back. "This isn't over," he said. Luke smiled coldly. "No," he agreed. "It's not." He watched as they got back in the SUV and drove off, the red taillights disappearing into the night. Luke stood there for a long moment before lowering the shotgun. They were getting desperate. And desperate people made mistakes. Luke was counting on it. Luke didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table, the shotgun resting against the wall beside him, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. His mind was running through every possibility, every potential move Carter and his people could make next. The men who had shown up to cut the lock hadn't been amateurs. They had moved with too much confidence, too much efficiency. These weren't just hired hands looking to cause trouble. These were people who had been sent with a purpose: to remove the evidence, to wipe away any sign that Carter's group had acted outside the law. That meant one thing: Luke had forced their hand. They were scrambling, trying to undo what he had exposed before it turned into a bigger problem. And that told him everything he needed to know. They weren't as secure in their position as they had pretended to be. The cracks were starting to show. The question was, how far were they willing to go to keep control? By the time the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Luke had made his decision. He wasn't waiting for them to make the next move. He was going to push them further, force them into a mistake they couldn't recover from. If they wanted to play dirty, they were going to find out just how much dirt he was willing to drag them through. The first thing he did was make a call to Daniel. "They tried to cut the lock last night," Luke said as soon as his friend picked up. 2 men, middle of the night, bolt cutters. Daniel let out a slow breath. "You call the sheriff." Luke shook his head even though Daniel couldn't see it. "No point. By the time they got here, those guys would have been long gone. And we both know the sheriff's office isn't exactly neutral in this." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "This is getting dangerous, Luke." "It was always dangerous," Luke said. "But now they know I'm not backing down." Daniel sighed. "What's your next move?" Luke leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his unshaven face. "I need to know where Carter's getting his support from. This isn't just about my farm anymore. He's been doing this to other people too, and I guarantee you there's someone backing him. You think it's the developers. I think it's bigger than that." Luke glanced at the papers spread out in front of him. These zoning changes didn't happen in a vacuum. Someone signed off on them, someone with enough pull to make things happen without raising too many questions. If I can figure out who that is, I can cut the head off this thing before they tighten the noose any further. Daniel hesitated. "I might know someone who can help." Luke frowned. "Who?" "A guy I used to work with," Daniel said carefully. "He deals in Let's just say he knows how to get information that isn't always easy to access. He used to work in municipal planning before he went private. If anyone can tell you who signed off on those zoning changes, it's him. Luke didn't ask how Daniel knew this guy. He didn't care. Set it up. That afternoon, Luke drove out to a small, unmarked office building on the outskirts of town. It looked abandoned from the outside, the kind of place that had been forgotten by time, but when he stepped inside, he was greeted by a man in his late 40s, with a sharp gaze and a knowing smirk. "You must be Davis," the man said, leaning back in his chair. "Daniel told me you had a problem." Luke didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need to know who approved the zoning changes on my land." The man nodded slowly. "That's not an easy thing to get. Those records aren't exactly public." Luke pulled a thick envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table. "I'm not asking for favors." The man chuckled, picking up the envelope and flipping through it. "All right, Mr. Davis, give me a day." Luke nodded and walked out without another word. He had done enough business in his life to know when to push and when to step back. Right now he needed to let things unfold. But Carter didn't give him the luxury of waiting. That night, just as Luke was locking up the barn, he heard the unmistakable sound of a truck pulling onto his property. He stepped out into the open, watching as two uniformed officers climbed out, their hands resting casually on their belts. One of them he recognized Deputy Ross, a man who had always been friendly enough in the past, but tonight his expression was unreadable. "Evening," Luke Ross said, his tone careful. "We got a call about a disturbance on your property." Luke folded his arms. "What kind of disturbance?" Ross exchanged a glance with his partner. Caller said there was an altercation. "Possible firearm involved." Luke let out a short laugh. "Let me guess. No name on the complaint." Ross didn't answer, which was answer enough. Luke exhaled through his nose. "You're not here to investigate a disturbance. You're here to rattle me." "Come on," Luke Ross said quietly. "Just let us take a look around. We'll be out of your hair in 10 minutes. Luke didn't move. He knew his rights, knew they didn't have probable cause to enter without a warrant. But he also knew that refusing them outright would only escalate things further. He needed to play this smart. "Fine," he said finally. "Look around all you want, but you touch anything, and I call my lawyer." Ross nodded, signaling to his partner. They moved through the property with practiced efficiency, checking the barn, the truck, even peering into the house through the windows. Luke stood still, watching, waiting. They didn't find anything. Because there was nothing to find. When they finally climbed back into their cruiser, Ross gave Luke one last look. "Be careful, Davis." Luke's jaw tightened. "You too." As the taillights disappeared down the road, Luke felt the tension coil tighter in his chest. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. They were looking for a way to pin something on him, to discredit him, to make him a problem that could be removed. But they had underestimated him. By morning he had his answer. The man Daniel had set him up with delivered. The name on the zoning approvals wasn't just some faceless bureaucrat. It was someone with real power, someone who had a direct financial interest in Horizon Development's success. Councilman Richard Lowell, a man who had built his career on quiet deals and backroom negotiations, a man who had everything to lose if someone started pulling at the wrong threads. Luke smiled to himself. Now he had a target, and he wasn't going to stop until the whole damn thing came crashing down. Luke had always believed that when people got desperate, they made mistakes. He had spent years dealing with men who thought they were untouchable, men who operated in boardrooms and backrooms, shaking hands over deals that would ruin lives without a second thought. He had seen what happened when someone pushed them too hard, forced them out of their comfort zone. They scrambled, they overplayed their hand, they exposed themselves, and Carter, for all his careful maneuvering, was about to make that fatal error. The moment Luke got confirmation that Councilman Richard Lowell had signed off on the zoning changes, he knew exactly how this would end. Lowell wasn't just some low-level official rubber-stamping documents. He was directly tied to Horizon Development's expansion projects. His name had appeared in land acquisitions before, buried under shell companies and redirected funds, always just distant enough to avoid scrutiny. But this time they had gotten careless. They had assumed that no one would look too closely, that Luke would be like the others, just another landowner too overwhelmed, too exhausted, too damn frustrated to fight. They had been wrong. Luke had spent the last 24 hours preparing. He knew this wouldn't be a clean victory. People like Lowell didn't go down quietly, and men like Carter had too much riding on this deal to let it collapse without a fight. They would try something, one last push to get him out of the way before things spiraled beyond their control. He just had to be ready when they did. It didn't take long. The first sign came at dusk. Luke was standing on his porch, drinking a cup of coffee as the sun dipped below the horizon, when he noticed the dust cloud rising in the distance. A convoy of 3 black SUVs, moving fast, heading straight for his property. He set his cup down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and walked down the steps. He didn't bother grabbing a weapon this time. He didn't need one. This wasn't that kind of fight. The vehicle skidded to a stop just outside the locked gate, engines idling, doors opening in unison. Carter was the first to step out, dressed in his usual polished arrogance, his tie slightly loosened, as if this was just another business meeting. Behind him, 2 other men climbed out, one of them the same guy Luke had seen at the Horizon Development office. The third man was unfamiliar, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of guy whose presence was meant to be a warning. Luke didn't move. Carter adjusted his cuffs, then gestured toward the locked gate. "This is getting tiresome, Davis." Luke met his gaze, unblinking. "Then stop wasting your time." Carter sighed, shaking his head like a disappointed teacher dealing with an unruly student. "You think you've got us backed into a corner, but let me explain something to you. This deal is happening. Horizon has already secured preliminary funding. And the contracts are being finalized. Your land is a formality at this point. You're stalling a process that's going to move forward with or without you." Luke smirked. "Funny. That's not what Councilman Lowell said when I sent over the documents proving he signed off on a fraudulent land acquisition." Carter's expression barely flickered, but Luke saw it, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers twitched at his sides. He knew. He had just been blindsided. "Lowell is a sitting councilman," Carter said after a beat, his voice measured. "You really think you can take him down with a few pieces of paper?" Luke shrugged. "I think a state-level ethics investigation, combined with a few well-placed calls to the right reporters, will do just fine. Public records are a funny thing. You can bury them in paperwork, hide them behind legalese, but once the right people start digging, well, let's just say I wouldn't want to be the guy trying to explain why $500,000 in development grants were redirected to shell corporations that just so happened to be tied to Horizon's parent company." Silence. Palance. The third man, the enforcer, shifted slightly, as if waiting for a signal. Luke's eyes flicked to him briefly before settling back on Carter. "You want to threaten me?" Luke continued, his voice quieter now. "Go ahead. You want to send your guys onto my property in the middle of the night again? Be my guest. But none of that changes the fact that you're finished. Horizon is already getting nervous. You think they want their name dragged into a corruption scandal? You think they're going to keep backing? Once they realize Lowell is dead weight, they're going to cut ties before you even have a chance to clean this up. And when that happens, you're just another liability." Carter's breathing had changed. Slower, controlled. He was weighing his options. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "What do you want?" Luke smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You know what I want." Carter's jaw tensed, but he nodded toward the man in the suit, who pulled out a phone and made a call. A few seconds later, Luke heard the sound of another vehicle approaching from the opposite direction. A tow truck. The chain was removed within minutes, the heavy metal links clattering to the ground as the lock was cut. The SUV doors closed again, and Carter took one last step toward the gate. "This isn't over," he said. Luke met his gaze without flinching. "For you? Yeah, it is." Carter studied him for a long moment, then turned and got back into his vehicle. The convoy rolled away, leaving only the dust and the lingering tension in the air. Luke didn't move until they were out of sight. Then, slowly, he reached down, picked up the broken lock, and turned it over in his hands. They had tried everything. Intimidation, legal maneuvering, backroom deals, even outright threats. And they had lost, because in the end they had made the same mistake every man like Carter made. They had underestimated the one thing they couldn't control: a man with nothing to lose. The dust from Carter's convoy had long settled, and the heavy steel chain that had blocked Luke's gate lay discarded in the dirt like the last remnants of a battle that had finally ended. But Luke knew better than to believe it was truly over. People like Carter didn't just disappear. They regrouped, they strategized, and when the dust cleared, they found new angles to exploit. But this time, Carter and his people had been exposed. Their game had been dragged into the light, and no amount of backroom deals or threats could undo what had been set in motion. The damage had been done, and Luke had made sure it was permanent. For the next few days, he kept to himself, going about his work like nothing had changed, even though everything had. The farm had suffered, orders had been delayed, suppliers had grown wary, and even some of his regular buyers had hesitated before agreeing to continue business with him. It wasn't hard to figure out why. Carter's influence ran deep, and just because he had lost this fight didn't mean he hadn't left behind a mess for Luke to clean up. But Luke had never been afraid of hard work. He knew that if he kept his head down, kept doing what he did best, people would come around. And they did. One by one, his customers returned. Orders started picking up. The damage Carter had tried to inflict wasn't permanent, just another hurdle to overcome. Then came the news. Daniel called him early one morning, the usual calm in his voice laced with something sharper satisfaction. "You might want to check the local news," he said. Lowell just announced his resignation. Luke blinked at the words, then turned on the old radio in the kitchen, adjusting the dial until the voices came through clearly. Citing personal reasons and a desire to step away from public service to focus on his family, however, sources suggest that the resignation may be linked to recent investigations into land acquisitions within the county, raising questions about the councilman's involvement in questionable zoning adjustments that benefited private developers. Luke listened in silence, a slow breath escaping his lips. It was expected. He had known it would happen eventually, but seeing it unfold so quickly only confirmed what he had already suspected: Lowell had been given a choice. Resign quietly, step away with some dignity, or risk being dragged through a scandal that would follow him for the rest of his career. He had chosen self-preservation. It didn't mean justice had been served, but it meant that the man who had signed off on selling Luke's land out from under him was out of power. And that was enough for now. Carter, on the other hand, had gone silent. Luke had expected some kind of retaliation, some last-ditch effort to hold on to what little influence he had left, but nothing came. No more legal notices, no unexpected visits from law enforcement, no more midnight intrusions on his property. It was like he had vanished. Luke wasn't naive. He knew Carter was still out there, licking his wounds, waiting for an opportunity to rebuild. But he also knew that Carter had been burned, and people like him rarely recovered from a loss like this. His credibility was shot, his backers had scattered, and the developers who had once treated him like an asset now saw him as a liability. Luke doubted he would ever be a real threat again. A week passed before Luke finally let himself relax, just a little. He sat on his porch one evening, the sun dipping low behind the trees, the air cool and quiet. He hadn't realized how much tension he had been carrying until now. For the first time in months, his land was truly his again. No chains, no paperwork, no looming threats. Just the familiar stretch of fields and fences, the distant sounds of cattle moving in the pens, the scent of earth and grass carried on the wind. It was a simple life, but it was his, and no one was going to take it from him. He thought about all the others who had lost their land to the same scheme, the ones who hadn't fought back or hadn't had the means to. Some had left quietly, selling off their homes for far less than they were worth, believing they had no other choice. Luke knew that what he had done wasn't just about his own farm. He had exposed something bigger, something that had been happening long before they had come for him. And now that it was out in the open, it wasn't going to disappear. Others would start asking questions. Others would fight back. The system that had allowed this to happen wasn't unbreakable. It only worked when people accepted it. A car pulled up to the gate, its headlights cutting through the dimming light. Luke tensed for half a second before recognizing the familiar silhouette inside. He got up from his chair and walked down the steps as Daniel stepped out of the car, looking as composed as ever. "Figured I'd stop by," Daniel said, closing the door behind him. "Make sure you hadn't burned the whole place down in a fit of victory rage." Luke smirked. Tempting, but no. Thought I'd just sit here and enjoy the silence for once. Daniel leaned against the truck, nodding toward the fields. "Looks like things are settling back to normal." Luke glanced around, exhaling slowly. "Yeah, feels like it." They stood there for a moment, watching as the last of the daylight faded into the horizon. Then Daniel pulled a folder from under his arm and held it out. "Before you get too comfortable, figured you might want to see this." Luke took the folder and flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages inside. It wasn't about his farm this time. It was about the other properties, the ones that had been lost before he started fighting back. The names of landowners, transaction histories, records of deals that had been forced through under the same methods Carter had tried to use on him. Evidence. Luke let out a low whistle. "You planning on taking this to the county?" Daniel shrugged. "That depends. You done fighting?" Luke didn't answer right away. He closed the folder and looked back out at the land, the place he had nearly lost, the place so many others had already given up on. He thought about Carter, about Lowell, about the men who had treated land and homes like chess pieces in a game no one else even realized they were playing. Then he smiled, just slightly. "No," he said. "I don't think I am," Daniel grinned. "Didn't think so." Luke tapped the folder against his palm, feeling the weight of it, feeling the fire that had carried him through this fight still burning just as strong. He had won this round, but there was more to do. More people who needed someone to stand up for them. And Luke Davis had never been the kind of man to walk away from a fight.